The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors where thousands of travelers moved like a river, flowing toward destinations unknown. Dr. Amara Thompson stood in the security line with the kind of patience that comes only from years of understanding that some battles are worth fighting and others require the wisdom to simply breathe and wait. At 45 years old, she carried herself with a quiet elegance that spoke of hard-won victories and silent wars fought in boardrooms and broken neighborhoods alike, her tailored navy blue suit fitting her frame with the precision of someone who understood that presentation mattered in a world that too often judged books by their covers before reading a single page. The Birkin bag hanging from her shoulder, a gift she had purchased for herself after her company's first profitable quarter, contained not just the usual items one might expect from a woman of her stature, but also a worn leather Bible her grandmother had pressed into her hands decades ago, with the admonition that faith without works is dead, and that God helps those who help themselves while remembering to help others along the way. She thought of Grandma Essie now, that formidable woman who had raised her in the West Side projects of Chicago after Amara's mother had succumbed to the siren call of substances that promised escape but delivered only deeper imprisonment. And she could almost hear that gravelly voice, seasoned with Virginia tobacco and Sunday morning hymns, telling her that trouble don't last always and that weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning if you just hold on a little while longer. The TSA agent, a middle-aged white man with kind eyes and a wedding band that caught the fluorescent light, waved her through the metal detector with a professional smile that didn't carry the weight of judgment she had grown accustomed to receiving in places where her presence was unexpected, and she wondered briefly if he had daughters at home and whether he taught them to see people as individuals rather than representatives of whatever stereotypes the world tried to impose upon them. Her carry-on rolled smoothly behind her as she made her way toward Gate C-27, passing a Chick-fil-A where the smell of waffle fries and chicken sandwiches reminded her of Sunday dinners after church, when such treats had been rare luxuries rather than convenience foods, and she remembered her grandmother scraping together coins to buy her a kid's meal as a reward for memorizing her Bible verses, insisting that education and faith were the twin pillars upon which any life worth living must be built. The gate area was already filling with the usual assortment of business travelers in their wrinkle-resistant fabrics, and families with children whose excitement about flying had not yet been dulled by the monotony of routine travel. And Amara found a seat near the window where she could watch the ground crew loading luggage into the belly of the Boeing 737 that would carry her from Atlanta to New York City for meetings that technically she didn't need to attend in person, but that she insisted on joining because her grandmother had taught her that a leader who doesn't show up is just a boss. And the world had enough bosses, but not nearly enough leaders who actually cared about the people whose lives depended on the decisions made in corner offices and executive suites. She opened her laptop, the latest MacBook Pro that her IT department had insisted she needed, and reviewed the quarterly reports from Skyward Airlines, the company she had built from nothing more than a dream and a small business administration loan that 3 banks had rejected before a black-owned credit union in Detroit had taken a chance on a young widow with more determination than collateral. The numbers told a story of steady growth in an industry where consolidation had made competition brutal, and where legacy carriers with decades of brand recognition could crush upstarts with the casual indifference of elephants stepping on ants. But she had found her niche by treating employees like family and customers like guests in her home, rather than just revenue streams to be optimized and maximized. Her late husband Marcus had believed in her vision even when venture capitalists had laughed her out of their offices, even when industry analysts had published think pieces about why another airline was exactly what America didn't need, even when friends and family had gently suggested that maybe she should consider something more practical and less likely to end in bankruptcy and heartbreak. He had died 3 years ago, a heart attack at 50 that the doctors said could have been prevented with better diet and less stress, and she had stood at his grave in Graceland Cemetery with rain mixing with tears on her face, and promised him that she would make Skyward Airlines not just profitable but purposeful, that it would be a company where a black girl from the projects could see herself in the executive suite and where a grandmother working as a flight attendant could actually afford to send her grandchildren to college without drowning in debt. The gate agent's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing that first-class passengers and those needing extra time could begin boarding, and Amara closed her laptop and stood with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to move through the world without making herself small to accommodate other people's discomfort with her presence. She had purchased this first-class ticket under her personal name rather than using her corporate account because she made it a practice to fly her own airline at least twice a month without announcing herself, sitting among regular passengers and listening to their conversations and complaints and compliments, understanding that the distance between the executive suite and the economy cabin was where many companies lost their souls and forgot why they existed in the first place. The ticket agent at the podium, a young white woman whose name tag read Jennifer and whose smile seemed genuine enough, scanned Amara's boarding pass without incident and wished her a pleasant flight. And Amara thanked her with the warmth that Grandma Essie had insisted was the mark of good breeding, regardless of whether you grew up in a mansion or a housing project, because manners cost nothing and could open doors that money and credentials sometimes could not. The jet bridge stretched before her like a tunnel between worlds, the recycled air carrying that distinctive airplane smell of cleaning products and jet fuel, and the accumulated breath of thousands of previous passengers. And she stepped into the aircraft, where the first-class cabin gleamed with leather seats and polished wood accents that her design team had fought for over the objections of bean counters, who insisted that passengers in the premium cabin cared only about width and legroom and free drinks. She had overruled them because she believed that beauty mattered and that people who worked hard enough to afford first class deserved an environment that celebrated their achievement rather than just tolerating their presence. And she ran her hand along the seat back as she moved toward 2A, her usual seat when she flew incognito because it offered a clear view of the cabin and the galley and allowed her to observe how her flight attendants interacted with passengers when they thought no one important was watching. The elderly white woman already seated in 2B looked up from her book, a well-worn copy of Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, and smiled with the kind of warmth that transcended racial boundaries and spoke to a shared humanity that too many people seemed eager to forget in an age of tribal loyalties and manufactured outrage. Amara settled into her seat and fastened her seatbelt, noting with satisfaction the smooth operation of the buckle and the quality of the leather that still smelled new, even though these particular seats had been installed 6 months ago. And she pulled out her own book, a biography of Madam C.J. Walker that she had been reading in stolen moments between meetings and conference calls, and the endless demands of running a business that employed over 2,000 people whose mortgages and car payments and children's college funds depended on her making the right decisions more often than she made wrong ones. The flight attendant appeared from the galley, a young white woman in her late 20s with blonde hair pulled back in a regulation bun and makeup applied with the precision of someone who understood that appearance was part of the uniform. And Amara noticed immediately the slight hesitation in her step as she took in the scene before her. The almost imperceptible pause that black people learn to recognize the way sailors read the sky for signs of coming storms. The flight attendant, whose name tag identified her as Jessica, approached with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. And Amara felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came from knowing what was about to happen, and being powerless to prevent it without creating a scene that would satisfy those who wanted black women to be angry and confrontational rather than composed and dignified. Jessica stopped at Amara's row and looked at her ticket display on the seatback screen, then at Amara herself, then back at the screen as if the numbers might rearrange themselves into a configuration that made more sense according to whatever internal logic governed her assumptions about who belonged in first class and who did not. The silence stretched for several seconds that felt like minutes, while other passengers continued boarding and squeezing past the bottleneck created by Jessica's stationary presence in the aisle, and Amara maintained eye contact with the steady gaze of someone who had nothing to prove but would not look away first, because looking away felt too much like acceptance of the judgment being rendered without words. Jessica's smile had frozen into something brittle and uncomfortable, the kind of expression people wear when they realize they've made a social error but aren't quite sure how to recover gracefully, and she cleared her throat with a small cough that sounded rehearsed and said in a tone that tried for professional but landed somewhere closer to condescending that she needed to verify Amara's boarding pass because there seemed to be some confusion about the seating assignments. Amara reached into her bag with movements that were deliberately slow and controlled, because she had learned long ago that sudden movements by black bodies in predominantly white spaces could trigger responses ranging from nervousness to outright hostility, and she produced her boarding pass from the leather portfolio where she kept her travel documents organized with the same attention to detail that she brought to every aspect of her life, because disorder was a luxury she had never been able to afford. Jessica examined the boarding pass with more scrutiny than seemed necessary for a simple verification process, holding it close to her face and then at arm's length, as if different distances might reveal some hidden truth that would justify her suspicions. And she asked in a voice that carried just far enough for nearby passengers to hear whether Amara had purchased this ticket herself or received it as an upgrade because company policy required verification of premium cabin assignments to prevent fraud and abuse of the system. The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire whose source remained hidden but whose damage was already spreading. And Amara felt the eyes of other passengers turning toward her with that peculiar mixture of curiosity and discomfort that white people often displayed when witnessing racism directed at someone else, because acknowledging it required them to choose sides, and choosing sides meant accepting responsibility for the pervasive nature of a problem they preferred to believe had been solved by civil rights legislation passed before many of them were born. She responded with a calm that belied the anger burning in her chest, like hot coals that she needed to contain because losing her temper would confirm stereotypes about angry black women and give Jessica exactly the ammunition she needed to justify calling security and having Amara removed from the plane, while passengers recorded the incident on their phones and posted it on social media with captions about another person of color getting exactly what she deserved for making trouble where none existed. Amara's voice remained steady as mountain stone when she explained that yes, she had indeed purchased this ticket with her own money using her own credit card, and that she would be happy to provide additional documentation if company policy truly required such verification. Though she had flown first class on dozens of airlines over the past 2 decades and had never been asked to prove her right to occupy a seat for which she had paid full fare. Jessica's face flushed with color that spread from her cheeks to her neck like spilled wine on white linen, and she stammered something about just following procedures and making sure everything was in order because they had experienced issues with fraudulent upgrades in recent months, though Amara noted with the sharpness of someone trained to spot inconsistencies in financial reports that Jessica had not asked the elderly white woman in 2B for any verification, nor had she questioned the middle-aged white man in 1A who was already sipping champagne from a plastic flute that caught the overhead lights and scattered tiny rainbows across the cabin ceiling. The elderly woman in 2B closed her book with a soft thump that seemed louder than it should have been in the growing silence, and she looked at Jessica with eyes that had witnessed enough history to recognize injustice wearing the mask of procedure. And she said in a voice that carried the authority of someone who had raised children and buried a husband and survived enough disappointments to know that staying silent in the face of wrong made you complicit in its continuation, that perhaps the young lady should simply accept the boarding pass as valid and allow the passengers to settle in for their flight, unless she planned to verify every single person's documentation, in which case they would all still be sitting on the ground when the sun set over the Atlantic Ocean. Jessica's expression hardened into something defensive and brittle, the look of someone who had been caught doing something questionable but lacked the self-awareness to recognize their own culpability in the situation. And she said with a tone that tried for authority, but landed closer to petulance, that she was just doing her job and following company guidelines, and that if passengers had a problem with standard procedures, they were welcome to file a complaint with customer service after the flight. She turned on her heel with the sharp precision of a soldier executing a parade ground maneuver and walked toward the galley where Amara could see her speaking in urgent whispers to another flight attendant, a young black woman whose name tag identified her as Tanya and whose eyes kept darting toward Amara with an expression that mixed sympathy with the kind of helpless frustration that comes from witnessing discrimination against someone who looks like you while being powerless to intervene. Without risking your own livelihood in an industry where jobs were hard to come by and easier to lose. The elderly woman in 2B leaned toward Amara and spoke in a voice meant only for her ears, apologizing for the behavior of someone who clearly had not been raised properly and assuring Amara that not all white people were so ignorant and prejudiced, though she understood if Amara's faith in humanity had been somewhat shaken by the encounter, because Lord knows she herself had experienced enough disappointment with her fellow Christians who claimed to love their neighbors while treating certain neighbors with considerably less love than others. Amara thanked her with genuine warmth because Grandma Essie had taught her that allies came in all colors, and that rejecting kindness because it came from an unexpected source was just another form of prejudice turned inside out, and she introduced herself as Amara without offering her last name or her title, because in this moment she wanted to be simply a woman sitting next to another woman, sharing the universal experience of trying to get from one place to another without incident. The elderly woman introduced herself as Margaret Callahan from Savannah, a retired school teacher who had spent 40 years trying to teach children not just reading and mathematics, but also the kind of character and compassion that couldn't be measured on standardized tests, but that determined whether they grew into adults who made the world better or worse through their daily choices and actions. They spoke quietly about books and faith and the strange loneliness of air travel that somehow made strangers willing to share confidences they might never reveal to people they saw every day. And Margaret mentioned that she was traveling to New York to visit her granddaughter who had just given birth to Margaret's first great-grandchild, a little girl named Grace, who Margaret prayed would grow up in a world more just and kind than the one into which she had been born, though progress seemed to move at the pace of glaciers while hatred spread like wildfire across social media and cable news channels that profited from division and fear. Jessica returned from the galley accompanied by a man whose uniform identified him as a supervisor, his name tag reading Mark Stevens, and his posture carrying the kind of self-importance that middle management often mistakes for actual authority. And he approached Amara's row with an expression that suggested he had already made up his mind about the situation before hearing any actual facts or evidence. He addressed Amara in a tone that managed to be simultaneously condescending and falsely cheerful, the voice of someone speaking to a child or a pet. rather than a grown woman with advanced degrees and more responsibility than he would likely carry in his entire career. And he said that there seemed to be some confusion about her ticket, and that he would need to see not just her boarding pass, but also a government-issued photo identification and the credit card used to purchase the ticket. Because they had strict policies about premium cabin seating and needed to ensure that everything was completely legitimate and above board. Amara felt the familiar weight settling onto her shoulders, the exhausted recognition that came from realizing this battle would not end quickly or easily, and that she faced a choice between making a scene that would mark her as difficult and angry or submitting to humiliation that would mark her as compliant and weak. And she thought of her grandmother standing in that cramped kitchen in Chicago, mixing cornbread batter and telling young Amara that dignity meant knowing your worth, even when the world insisted you had none, and that sometimes the strongest thing you could do was refuse to participate in your own degradation. She opened her wallet with movements that felt mechanical and distant, as if she were watching herself from somewhere outside her body, a dissociative trick she had learned during childhood when the world became too painful to experience directly. And she produced her driver's license and her Platinum American Express card and her boarding pass and laid them on the tray table in front of her with the careful precision of someone dealing cards in a high-stakes game. Mark examined each document with theatrical thoroughness, holding her license up to the light as if checking for forgeries and comparing her face to the photo with exaggerated scrutiny that suggested he expected to find discrepancies between the woman sitting before him and the woman pictured on the laminated card, and he asked whether she had received this ticket as some kind of prize or giveaway because the system was showing some irregularities in the booking that he couldn't quite explain, though he didn't specify what those irregularities might be or why they warranted this level of investigation. Other passengers had begun to notice the commotion, their conversations trailing off into silence as they turned to watch the drama unfolding in row 2, and Amara could feel their eyes on her like physical weight pressing down on her shoulders and chest, making it harder to breathe in the recycled air that suddenly felt thick and suffocating. A businessman in row 3 pulled out his phone and began recording, the tiny red light of his camera app glowing like an accusatory eye in the dimmed cabin lighting. And Margaret Callahan spoke up again with more force this time, saying that she had been flying for 50 years and had never witnessed such disgraceful treatment of a paying passenger, and that if this was how Skyward Airlines treated people in first class, she would certainly think twice before booking with them again. Mark's face flushed darker, and he said that he appreciated her concern, but that this was a security matter, and that he would need to ask her to please mind her own business and allow him to do his job. And Margaret responded that discrimination was everyone's business, especially when it was happening right in front of her face, and that she had not survived the civil rights movement and the women's liberation movement and 40 years of teaching in underfunded public schools just to sit quietly, while someone abused their tiny bit of power to humiliate another human being. The tension in the cabin had become palpable, a living thing that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, and passengers were choosing sides with their body language and facial expressions even if they remained silent, some nodding in agreement with Margaret while others looked away uncomfortably as if hoping the situation would resolve itself without requiring them to take any moral position that might prove inconvenient or socially awkward. Mark's voice had taken on an edge of genuine anger now, the mask of professional courtesy slipping to reveal the face beneath, and he said that if Amara could not provide satisfactory proof that she had legitimately purchased this first-class ticket, then he would have no choice but to ask her to move to an economy seat or deplane entirely, and that airport security was standing by if she chose to make this difficult. Amara felt something shift inside her chest, a door closing on patience and opening on something harder and sharper, and she reached into her Birkin bag, not for more identification, but for the slim leather portfolio that contained her business cards, the ones printed on heavy cotton paper with raised lettering that spelled out her name and title in understated elegance. She thought of Marcus lying in that hospital bed at Northwestern Memorial 3 years ago, with tubes and wires connecting his failing body to machines that beeped and hummed their mechanical lullabies, and she remembered how he had squeezed her hand with what little strength remained and told her that Skyward Airlines was her legacy and her purpose, and that she must never let anyone make her feel small or unworthy, because God had not brought her through poverty and loss and discrimination, just to see her defeated by people who judged books by their covers and valued appearance over substance. She thought of the loan officer at First Community Credit Union who had taken a chance on her business plan when bigger banks with fancier offices had shown her the door, and she thought of her first 10 employees who had worked for deferred salaries and equity shares because they believed in the vision of an airline that treated people like family rather than cargo to be processed efficiently. She thought of late nights in a rented office space above a dry cleaner on the south side, studying aircraft leasing agreements and FAA regulations, while the smell of cleaning chemicals seeped through the floorboards and mixed with the coffee she drank by the gallon to stay awake and focused. She thought of the first plane she had managed to lease, a used Boeing 737 that had seen better days, but that she and her skeleton crew had cleaned and maintained until it shone like new money. And she remembered standing on the tarmac at Midway Airport, watching that plane take off on its first scheduled flight, with tears streaming down her face because impossible dreams sometimes came true if you refused to stop dreaming them. She thought of all the black girls and brown girls and poor girls from neighborhoods like the one where she had grown up who might see themselves in her story and dare to dream bigger dreams than their circumstances suggested were possible. And she knew that what happened in the next few moments would matter not just for her personal dignity, but for every person who had ever been judged unworthy based on the color of their skin or the texture of their hair or the unfamiliar sound of their name. Mark was saying something about calling airport security and having her escorted off the plane if she couldn't provide proper documentation, and Jessica stood behind him with arms crossed and expressions smug as if she had been vindicated in her initial suspicions, and the businessman with the phone was still recording while Margaret Callahan had pulled out her own phone and was apparently texting someone about the situation unfolding before her disbelieving eyes. Tanya, the young black flight attendant, had moved closer to the galley entrance, where she could watch without being directly involved, and her face showed the kind of anguish that comes from witnessing someone who looks like you being degraded, while your paycheck and your career advancement depend on staying neutral and invisible. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing that there would be a slight delay in departure due to a minor issue that needed to be resolved, and asking passengers to please remain seated with their seatbelts fastened. And Amara knew that Mark had radioed the cockpit to warn them of a potential problem passenger who might need to be removed before they could push back from the gate. She pulled the business card from her portfolio and held it between 2 fingers like a playing card about to be revealed in a game of poker where the stakes involved more than money. And she looked up at Mark with eyes that had seen too much hardship to be intimidated by someone whose greatest accomplishment was probably a middle management position at a regional airline. She handed the card to Mark with a gesture that was neither aggressive nor submissive, but simply matter-of-fact, the way you might hand a receipt to a cashier or a ticket to a parking attendant. And she watched his face as he read the embossed letters that spelled out Dr. Amara Thompson, Chief Executive Officer and Founder, Skyward Airlines, along with contact information for the corporate headquarters in Chicago and her direct line that only a handful of people in the world possessed. The color drained from his face like water swirling down a drain, leaving behind a pallor that made him look suddenly ill. and his mouth opened and closed several times without producing any sound, as if his brain had temporarily lost the ability to form words or coherent thoughts. Jessica leaned over his shoulder to read the card, and her reaction was even more dramatic. A sharp intake of breath, followed by a visible trembling that started in her hands and spread through her entire body, and she took an involuntary step backward, as if the card contained some contagious disease that might infect her through proximity alone. The businessman with the phone shifted his camera angle to capture Mark's expression, recognizing that something significant was happening even if he didn't yet understand the full implications, and Margaret Callahan let out a sound that was half laugh and half something that might have been hallelujah, spoken under her breath like a prayer of thanksgiving for divine justice, delivered swiftly and without warning. Mark's voice, when he finally found it, was several octaves higher than before, and carried a tremor that spoke of careers flashing before eyes and retirement plans evaporating like morning dew under harsh sunlight. And he said something about not realizing and not being informed, and there must have been some kind of miscommunication, because surely if he had known who she was, this entire misunderstanding could have been avoided. Amara let the silence stretch for several heartbeats while she watched him squirm. Not because she took pleasure in his discomfort exactly, but because she understood that this moment was teaching him something that no diversity training seminar or corporate memo could ever convey with the same visceral impact. And she thought about all the other passengers who had probably been subjected to similar treatment by Mark and Jessica, and countless others like them who wielded their small portions of power like weapons against people they deemed unworthy of basic human dignity. She thought about the statistics she had read in a Harvard Business Review article about how black travelers were disproportionately targeted for additional screening and questioning, and how black passengers in premium cabins faced higher rates of seat challenges and verification requests than their white counterparts, even when controlling for all other variables. And she thought about how those dry academic statistics translated into real human experiences of humiliation and degradation that accumulated over time, like small cuts that individually seemed minor but collectively bled you dry of the faith that the world could ever really change. The captain emerged from the cockpit, a tall black man in his mid-50s, whose name tag identified him as Captain Raymond Morrison, and whose decorated uniform suggested decades of experience flying everything from puddle jumpers to international wide bodies, and his face registered immediate recognition when he saw Amara, followed by confusion as he took in the scene of Mark holding her business card, while Jessica stood frozen like a department store mannequin. Captain Morrison had been one of her earliest hires when Skyward Airlines was still just 3 planes and a dream, and he had taken a pay cut from his position at Delta because he believed in her vision of creating an airline where black pilots and flight attendants wouldn't constantly have to prove they belonged in the cockpit or the cabin. And she knew that he would understand exactly what had transpired here without needing lengthy explanations. He addressed Mark with a tone that managed to be professional while carrying an undercurrent of barely controlled anger, asking what exactly was happening and why they were delaying departure to question a passenger who happened to be the person who signed both their paychecks and who had built this airline from nothing into a thriving business that employed over 2,000 people and served 35 cities across North America. Mark stammered something incoherent about routine procedures and security protocols, while Jessica had gone completely silent, her earlier smugness replaced by an expression of absolute terror, as she apparently contemplated the various ways her life was about to become significantly more difficult. Amara stood up slowly, her 5'7" frame somehow seeming to fill more space than her physical dimensions would suggest, and she spoke in a voice that carried throughout the first-class cabin without being raised, because Grandma Essie had taught her that truly powerful people never needed to shout, since real authority came from who you were rather than how loud you could be. She said that she appreciated Captain Morrison's concern, but that this situation was exactly why she made a practice of flying her own airline incognito, because she needed to understand the experience of regular passengers who didn't have the protection of a title or position to shield them from the kind of treatment she had just received. And she said that Mark and Jessica were simply doing what they had probably been trained to do, either explicitly through company policies that targeted certain types of passengers, or implicitly through the cultural messages they had absorbed their entire lives about who belonged in premium spaces and who should be questioned and challenged and made to prove their worthiness. She turned to address the other passengers who were watching with expressions ranging from shock to satisfaction to discomfort. And she said that this moment was uncomfortable for everyone, but that discomfort was often the price of growth, and that she hoped they would remember what they had witnessed here and perhaps think twice the next time they saw someone being treated poorly by people in positions of authority, because silence in the face of injustice made you complicit in its perpetuation, regardless of your personal beliefs or intentions. Margaret Callahan spoke up again, her voice carrying the weight of decades spent standing up for students who couldn't always stand up for themselves, and she said that she had spent her entire teaching career trying to instill in young people the understanding that character was revealed not in how you treated people who could help you, but in how you treated people who seemingly could do nothing for you. And she said that Mark and Jessica had failed that test spectacularly, but that she prayed they would learn from this experience and become better people than they had shown themselves to be today. The businessman with the phone lowered his camera and said in a voice that suggested genuine remorse that he was ashamed he had been recording this for entertainment value rather than immediately speaking up to defend Amara, and he apologized for his own complicity in the situation, even though his silence had been less actively harmful than Mark and Jessica's actions. Other passengers began murmuring their own apologies and expressions of support, and Amara felt the emotional weight of the moment settling onto her shoulders like a heavy coat that she hadn't asked to wear, but that seemed to be her permanent wardrobe in a world that still judged people by appearances rather than character. She thought about the verse from 1 Corinthians that Grandma Essie used to quote about how we see through a glass darkly, but someday we'll see face to face. And she wondered if that someday would arrive in her lifetime, or if her granddaughters and great-granddaughters would still be fighting these same battles decades from now, because prejudice was like kudzu vine in the Georgia heat, always finding new ways to spread and choke out anything beautiful and good that tried to grow. If this story is touching your heart and opening your eyes to the dignity every person deserves, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss these powerful stories that remind us of our shared humanity. And leave a comment saying, "A stunning lesson in grace under fire," to inspire others who need to hear this message today. She asked Mark and Jessica to follow her to the galley where they could have a private conversation away from the cameras and curious eyes, and Captain Morrison returned to the cockpit after giving her a look that conveyed both support and concern. And she led the way down the narrow aisle with Mark and Jessica trailing behind like condemned prisoners walking to their execution. Tanya, the young black flight attendant, moved aside to give them space, and Amara noticed the tears streaming down her face and the way her hands gripped the galley counter as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. And she made a mental note to speak with Tanya privately later, because she recognized the expression of someone who had been carrying their own stories of discrimination and degradation, and who saw in this moment a kind of validation that their experiences were real and unjust, rather than imagined or oversensitive as they had probably been told countless times. The galley was cramped and smelled of coffee and the pre-packaged meals that would be served once they finally got airborne. And Amara stood with her back to the service counter and looked at Mark and Jessica, who could barely meet her eyes, and asked them a simple question that she already knew would be difficult for them to answer honestly, because honest self-reflection required a level of courage that most people lacked when confronted with their own prejudices and failures. She asked them what exactly they had seen when they looked at her, what signals and markers had triggered their decision to question her presence in first class and demand additional verification that they had not requested from any white passenger in the cabin. And she told them that she wanted the truth rather than comfortable lies or corporate speak about procedures and policies, because this moment was an opportunity for genuine growth if they could find the courage to be vulnerable and honest. Mark spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper, and he said something about how he had made assumptions based on her appearance, and that he realized now those assumptions were rooted in stereotypes and prejudices he had absorbed from media and culture, and probably from his own family growing up in a small town in rural Ohio, where the only black people he ever saw were on television news stories about crime or poverty or sports. And he said that he knew those were not excuses, but simply explanations for how he had come to be standing here, facing the consequences of his own ignorance and bias. Jessica was crying openly now, mascara running down her cheeks in dark rivulets that made her look younger and more vulnerable than she had appeared when she was questioning Amara's ticket, with that superior expression that suggested she had caught someone trying to get away with something they hadn't earned. And she said that she had grown up in suburban Atlanta, in a neighborhood that was all white and all middle class, and that she had learned from her parents and her friends and her church youth group that there was a right kind of people and a wrong kind of people, and that the right kind looked and talked and dressed a certain way that now she realized was just code for white and wealthy. Amara listened without interrupting because she understood that confession required space and silence, and she thought about how many times she had wanted to rage and scream and make people feel the pain they had inflicted on her through their casual cruelty and thoughtless prejudice. But she also thought about Grandma Essie saying that hurt people, and that the cycle only ended when someone was strong enough to absorb the pain without passing it on to the next person in line. She told Mark and Jessica that she was not going to fire them immediately, because unemployment would simply send them out into the world to inflict their prejudices on other people in other contexts. But she said that they would be required to undergo extensive training on implicit bias and systemic racism, and that they would be reassigned to routes and positions where their performance could be monitored closely. And she said that if they ever treated another passenger the way they had treated her today, their employment would be terminated immediately without appeal or second chances. She told them that this was an opportunity for redemption, but that redemption required genuine transformation rather than just learning to hide their prejudices more effectively. And she said that she would be watching their progress personally because she had built Skyward Airlines to be different from other carriers where discrimination was overlooked or tacitly encouraged, as long as it didn't generate negative publicity or lawsuits. She returned to her seat where Margaret Callahan greeted her with a warm smile and a whispered, "Well done," that carried more approval than a standing ovation would have conveyed. And the other passengers who made eye contact offered nods and small gestures of respect that suggested they had witnessed something significant, even if they couldn't quite articulate what it meant or how it might change their own behavior going forward. Captain Morrison's voice came over the intercom, apologizing for the delay and announcing that they would be pushing back from the gate momentarily. And Amara fastened her seatbelt and looked out the window at the ground crew loading the last pieces of luggage and the fuel truck pulling away from the wing, and she felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness and everything to do with the emotional labor of constantly having to prove her humanity and worth to people who should have extended basic courtesy without requiring proof or credentials. The plane lifted off the runway with the familiar sensation of gravity pressing passengers back into their seats, and Amara watched Atlanta shrink below them until the city became a collection of toy buildings arranged on a grid that suggested order and planning, even though she knew the reality on the ground was far messier and more complicated than the aerial view suggested. Margaret Callahan had fallen asleep almost immediately after takeoff, with her head tilted against the window and her book still open on her lap. And Amara envied her ability to find peace so quickly after witnessing such a disturbing encounter, though perhaps when you had lived 80-some years, you developed the capacity to compartmentalize trauma and move forward because dwelling on every injustice would paralyze you completely. Tanya approached with the beverage cart, her eyes still red-rimmed from crying, and she leaned close to Amara and whispered that she wanted to thank her for handling that situation with such grace and dignity because she had witnessed similar incidents dozens of times in her 3 years working for Skyward Airlines and had felt helpless to intervene without risking her job and the income that supported her elderly mother and her 2 children who were both in college at Howard University, studying engineering and pre-medicine. Amara took Tanya's hand and squeezed it gently, understanding without words the burden of being a black woman in service positions where you were expected to smile and defer and accommodate even when you witnessed terrible things happening to people who looked like you. And she made a mental note to review the company's policies about empowering employees to speak up when they witnessed discrimination, because having policies was meaningless if people were afraid to use them. The flight continued without further incident, the hours passing in that strange, suspended state that air travel creates, where you exist neither here nor there but somewhere in between. And Amara used the time to reflect on the morning's events and what they revealed about the work that still needed to be done, not just at Skyward Airlines, but in American society more broadly. She thought about the statistics she had read showing that despite comprising only about 45% of the American population, white Christians held 70% of corporate leadership positions and made 80% of the decisions about who got hired and promoted and trusted with responsibility, and she thought about how those numbers translated into everyday experiences like the one she had just endured, where a black woman's presence in first class was automatically suspicious, while a white man's presence was automatically assumed to be legitimate. She thought about the churches she had attended growing up, mostly Baptist congregations on the South Side, where preachers thundered about justice and righteousness and the promised land that God had prepared for his people if they just held on a little while longer. And she wondered what those preachers would say about a country where black people were 3 times more likely to be poor and 5 times more likely to be incarcerated and twice as likely to die from preventable diseases, even though they prayed just as hard and worked just as diligently as their white counterparts, who somehow always seemed to land on their feet even when they made terrible decisions or committed actual crimes. The plane began its descent into LaGuardia Airport with the characteristic bumps and jolts that came from changing altitudes, and Amara gathered her belongings and prepared for landing, while Margaret Callahan woke from her nap and immediately asked whether Amara was all right, because the older woman had been praying for her during her sleep and felt led by the Holy Spirit to check on her emotional state. Amara assured her that she was fine, or at least as fine as anyone could be after such an experience, and Margaret said that she planned to write a letter to Skyward Airlines commending Amara's handling of the situation, and Amara had to suppress a smile as she imagined the customer service representative who would receive that letter and the confusion that would ensue when they tried to forward it to the CEO, who was also the subject of the commendation. They exchanged contact information before deplaning, Margaret insisting that Amara must come visit her in Savannah sometime and meet her great-granddaughter Grace, who Margaret was convinced would grow up to be president or a Supreme Court justice, or perhaps the first woman to walk on Mars, because that child had a spirit that couldn't be contained by earthly limitations or societal expectations. Amara promised to visit if she ever found herself in Savannah, and she meant it because Margaret reminded her of Grandma Essie in the best possible ways. That combination of faith and fire that refused to accept injustice as inevitable or permanent. The weeks following the incident unfolded with a momentum that surprised even Amara, who had built a career on anticipating consequences and planning for contingencies, because the businessman who had recorded the confrontation had posted the video to his Twitter account, where it had been viewed 17 million times within 48 hours and had sparked conversations about racism in air travel that dominated news cycles and social media feeds and water cooler conversations across the country. The video showed Mark demanding additional verification and Jessica's smug expression and Amara's calm, dignified responses, and it ended with the revelation of her identity and Mark's face draining of color. And commenters ranged from those praising Amara's restraint and grace to those arguing she should have fired Mark and Jessica on the spot, to those inevitably claiming the whole thing was staged or that she had somehow provoked the situation by her attitude or appearance. Major news outlets picked up the story, and Amara found herself fielding interview requests from CNN and NPR and the New York Times, and she used each platform to talk not about her personal experience, but about the broader patterns of discrimination that Black travelers face daily, citing research from Georgetown University showing that Black passengers were stopped for additional screening at twice the rate of white passengers, and that Black families flying together were more likely to be questioned about their relationships and their reasons for travel, as if family vacations were somehow suspicious when undertaken by people with melanin-rich skin. Corporate headquarters in Chicago became overwhelmed with media requests and customer feedback that split roughly along predictable demographic lines, with younger customers and customers of color largely praising Amara's response, while older white customers expressed concern that she was being too divisive and that the incident was being blown out of proportion when Mark and Jessica were just doing their jobs in a post-9/11 world where security had to be taken seriously, even if it meant occasionally inconveniencing innocent people. Amara read through hundreds of these comments personally, looking for patterns and insights that might inform new policies and training programs, and she was struck by how many people seemed unable or unwilling to understand that being Black in America meant navigating a constant stream of small humiliations and large dangers that white Americans could choose to notice or ignore depending on their personal preferences and comfort levels. She thought about a phrase she had heard at a conference on racial equity, that privilege was invisible to those who had it the same way water was invisible to fish who had never experienced life outside the ocean, and she wondered how to make visible something that had been designed over centuries to remain unseen and unacknowledged. She called a company-wide meeting that was broadcast via video conference to all 2,000 employees across 35 cities, and she stood in front of the camera in the same conference room where she had pitched her business plan to her first investors a decade ago. And she told the assembled employees that the incident on Flight 447 from Atlanta to New York was not an isolated problem with two bad actors, but rather a symptom of systemic issues that required systemic solutions. She announced the creation of a new position of Chief Diversity Officer who would report directly to her and who would have authority to implement mandatory training programs and revise hiring practices and investigate complaints of discrimination without interference from department managers who might be more concerned about protecting their teams than protecting vulnerable passengers and employees. She announced that Skyward Airlines would be partnering with the NAACP and the Anti-Defamation League and several other civil rights organizations to develop best practices for addressing implicit bias in the airline industry, And she said that every employee, from baggage handlers to senior executives, would be required to complete quarterly training sessions on topics ranging from microaggressions to systemic racism to the history of discrimination in American transportation, from the back of the bus to the questioning of first-class passengers. The announcement generated mixed reactions, predictably, with some employees expressing enthusiasm and others grumbling about political correctness run amok and the burden of additional training requirements. And Amara received several resignation letters from employees who said they couldn't work for a company that was so focused on race rather than just treating everyone the same regardless of color. She read those resignation letters carefully and felt a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness because it meant those employees had learned nothing from the incident, and relief because she didn't want people working for Skyward Airlines who couldn't understand why treating everyone the same was actually a form of discrimination, when some people started from positions of disadvantage and needed different levels of support to achieve equal outcomes. She thought about a sermon she had heard years ago at Trinity United Church of Christ about how equality meant giving everyone the same thing, but equity meant giving everyone what they needed to succeed. And the example the pastor had used was about 3 children trying to see over a fence to watch a baseball game. And if you gave all 3 children the same size box to stand on, then the tallest child could see easily, while the shortest child still couldn't see anything. But if you gave different sized boxes based on each child's height, then all 3 could watch the game together. Jessica reached out 3 weeks after the incident requesting a meeting, and Amara agreed to see her in her office on the 40th floor of the Willis Tower in downtown Chicago, where Skyward Airlines had recently moved after outgrowing their original space above the dry cleaner on the south side. Jessica arrived 15 minutes early and sat in the reception area with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes red, as if she had been crying on the train ride from the suburb where she lived with her parents while she figured out what to do with her life now that it had been turned upside down by her own actions and their consequences. Amara's assistant, a young woman named Keisha, who had been with her since the beginning, and who knew her well enough to anticipate her needs before she articulated them, brought Jessica water and tissues and assured her that Dr. Thompson was not as scary as she probably seemed in viral videos that had been viewed by half the country. When Amara finally called Jessica into her office, the young woman stood on shaking legs and walked across the threshold like someone entering a courtroom to hear their sentence. And Amara gestured to the comfortable chairs arranged near the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered stunning views of Lake Michigan, stretching blue and infinite toward the horizon where water met sky in a line so perfect it looked drawn by divine hand. Jessica spoke haltingly at first, and then with increasing fluency, as if confession created its own momentum once you broke through the initial resistance. And she told Amara about growing up in a household where her father watched Fox News constantly, and where dinner table conversations revolved around complaints about affirmative action and illegal immigration and the war on Christmas. And she said that she had never questioned any of it because children don't question the water they swim in, until someone pulls them out and shows them that other waters exist, with different temperatures and different creatures and different rules about what was normal and acceptable. She said that she had spent the past 3 weeks reading books and watching documentaries and having painful conversations with a therapist who specialized in helping white people unpack their racial biases. And she said that she was beginning to understand that her entire worldview had been constructed on foundations that were rotting and dangerous, and that rebuilding would require tearing down walls she had thought were load-bearing, but turned out to be just partitions that could be removed, to create more space and light. She asked Amara if there was any way she could keep her job at Skyward Airlines because she needed the income, but also because she wanted to prove that people could change and grow and become better versions of themselves if given the opportunity and the accountability and the support systems that made transformation possible rather than just aspirational. Amara listened without interrupting because she recognized sincerity when she heard it, even though she also knew that sincerity alone was insufficient without sustained commitment and behavioral change over time. And she thought about all the second chances she had been denied in her own life because people had judged her by her zip code or her skin color or her mother's addiction rather than by her potential or her character or her willingness to work harder than anyone else in the room. She told Jessica that she could return to work, but that she would be on probation for 6 months and that any further complaints about her treatment of passengers would result in immediate termination. And she said that Jessica would be required to participate in weekly sessions with the company's new chief diversity officer, and that she would be assigned a mentor who could help her navigate the difficult work of confronting her own prejudices and learning to see people as individuals rather than representatives of whatever stereotypes she had absorbed during her 27 years of life in predominantly white spaces. Jessica cried tears that seemed genuine and thanked Amara repeatedly, and Amara felt the weight of responsibility that came with having power over someone else's livelihood and future, and she prayed silently that she had made the right decision, because mercy without accountability was just enabling. But accountability without mercy was just cruelty dressed up as justice. The months that followed brought changes that rippled outward from Skyward Airlines into the broader industry, as other carriers began examining their own practices and policies regarding passenger interactions and employee training. And Amara found herself invited to speak at conferences and congressional hearings about discrimination in air travel and the importance of creating corporate cultures that valued diversity, not as a checkbox to be marked, but as a genuine commitment to seeing and serving all of humanity. She returned to Graceland Cemetery on a cold November afternoon when the trees were bare and the ground was hard with early frost. And she stood at Marcus's grave with fallen leaves crunching under her feet and told him about everything that had happened since that morning in Atlanta when she had been forced to prove her worth to people who should have extended basic dignity without requiring proof. She told him that she was tired but not defeated, exhausted but not hopeless, and that she was determined to keep building Skyward Airlines into the kind of company they had dreamed about during those late-night conversations in their tiny apartment, when the future seemed simultaneously impossible and inevitable, depending on which day you asked and how much coffee you had consumed. She thought about Grandma Essie's favorite verse from Isaiah about mounting up with wings like eagles and running without being weary and walking without fainting. And she thought about how appropriate it was that her grandmother's faith had been expressed through metaphors of flight, when Amara had built her life's work around the miracle of humans defying gravity and soaring through skies that previous generations could only dream about reaching. She boarded another commercial flight the following week, this time on a competitor's airline, because she believed in understanding the full landscape of the industry she competed in, and she sat in first class without incident, while a flight attendant who was probably younger than Jessica brought her champagne in a real glass rather than a plastic flute. And she thought about how progress was measured not in dramatic revelations, but in quiet moments when people were simply allowed to exist, without having to constantly prove they belonged in whatever space they occupied. She pulled out her worn Bible and opened to the book of Micah, where Grandma Essie had underlined in faded pencil the verse about doing justice and loving mercy and walking humbly with your God. And she thought about how those three things were really just one thing expressed in different ways. And she prayed that she would have the strength to keep doing and loving and walking for however many years God granted her on this earth, where the arc of the moral universe bent toward justice, but only Because people like her and Margaret Callahan and Tanya and even Jessica, in her struggling transformation, kept pulling it in the right direction against the gravity of hatred and fear and the comfortable prejudices that allowed people to sleep soundly while others suffered the consequences of their indifference.